World War I changed the world, but it also changed England. Nearly 700,000 British men died, and yet, in a handful of villages, now known as Thankful Villages, every single man who went to war came home. Welcome to Footnoting History. My name is Jessica, and I'll be your host today. And in this episode, we're talking about the phenomena of thankful villages, places in England and Wales that didn't lose a single person during the First World War. There's also something called a doubly thankful village, which means that these villages didn't lose anyone during World War I or World War II. Now, by the end of World War I, nearly 700,000 British men had been killed, and there was no community left untouched. In Scotland, not a single village escaped loss. In Ireland, then still part of the United Kingdom, the story was the same. No one had escaped loss. And to understand the scale of that loss, there's a few cultural phenomenons that we need to consider. First is the existence of PAL battalions. This was a wartime recruiting strategy, one that was abandoned in 1917 because of the devastation that it caused. But it allowed men to enlist and serve alongside people they already knew. That means an entire group of friends, coworkers, or nearly every man from a single village could join and fight together. On paper, it sounded like a good idea. If you promised men they could serve with their brothers, their workmates, the boys they had grown up with, they were more likely to enlist. It was an effective recruiting tool, but the reality of trench warfare, where thousands of men could be killed in a single day, meant that small communities could suffer unimaginable losses in a matter of hours. In some PALS units, hundreds of men from the same town were killed or wounded in minutes of the first day of the Somme. The pattern was repeated across the front, and each time it happened, a town or village at home was suddenly and permanently changed. Eventually, the system had to be phased out because it was so obviously brutal and destructive at the community level that it was not sustainable, but also there was no more volunteers and conscription had begun. The second thing to consider is what it meant to be a soldier before the First World War and what it meant afterwards. Before 1914, the British Army was relatively small and professional, often seen as a career for a certain class of men or as a vehicle for policing and defending the empire rather than fighting a huge industrial war. Officers were disproportionately drawn from the aristocracy and upper middle class. Many regiments had long-standing traditions, and soldiering could feel, at least from the outside, like a specialized world apart from everyday civilian life. There was many a second and third son who were not going to inherit who chose soldiering as their career. And the war changed that. The scale of mobilization turned Britain into a nation in uniform. Mass recruitment, the PALS battalions, and later conscription drew in men from every social background. The old idea that an officer's commission was a birthright of the upper class began to erode. As casualties mounted and the army was forced to promote and commission men based on competence and necessity rather than just family and schooling. Technical demands for artillery, signals, machine guns, tank, and aviation meant that soldiers increasingly needed specialized training and skills, not just good breeding, courage, and discipline. Non-commissioned officers, too, became very central. Sergeants and corporals were often the ones holding units together in chaotic conditions. They were responsible for training and discipline and small unit tactics. Their roles as professional leaders on the ground became more visible and more essential. And because so many men served, the soldier was no longer a distant professional figure stationed overseas. He was a neighbor, a cousin, a clerk, a teacher. After the war, the government had to think seriously and reevaluate how they were going to do pensions, medical care, and long-term support for the millions of veterans they had created. That, in turn, changed the relationship between the state, the military, and ordinary people. And all of this contributed to a broader transformation. The war didn't just kill, it altered careers, expectation, and the very idea of who would fight for Britain and what was owed to them when they returned, if they returned. This reshaped England in other ways as well. It redistributed wealth and titles, often concentrating them among the already wealthy, while many communities lost an entire generation of young men. And yet there were exceptions. Some 53 villages across England and Wales had every man they sent to war return. Some of these villages were so small that their entire population could fit in a local pub. Others were somewhat larger, but out of roughly 16,000 villages, only 53 share this distinction. And today we're going to explore these thankful villages, what they are, what it means to be a survivor when all that is around you is widespread loss, and the reality that even those who came home were often profoundly changed by the experience. And to really dive into that, there's something else we have to talk about: memorialization. Almost immediately after the war, and even as casualty lists started to arrive, communities began to create memorials. Even today, if you visit towns and villages across the UK, you'll often find statues, plaques, or monuments dedicated to the fallen. This deliberate effort to remember the fallen changed the way that people mourned. For many, the bodies of their loved ones would never return. And while France may not seem that far away, most families would never cross the channel to be able to go to see the place where their loved one had passed. It was deeply felt that many of these men didn't just belong to their families, but they also belonged to their communities. And so memorialization became a key way in which not only did families recognize the loss, but there was a specific place in which memorialization and remembrance could happen for everyone. And this is exactly how the term Thankful Village came to be. It was coined by Arthur Mee, a journalist and writer best known for his children's encyclopedia. Later in life, he undertook an ambitious project, a county-by-county series of guidebooks called The King's England, documenting the landscape, history, and character of towns and villages. Beginning in the 1930s, as he traveled, Mee noticed something unusual. Alongside the expected war memorials, he occasionally found small, out-of-the-way villages that had no memorial to the dead. Instead, they displayed plaques or stained glass or a small tablet giving thanks that all those who had gone to war had returned. He was deeply moved by this, and in the first volume of his series, he described these places as Thankful Villages, and the name stuck. At the time, Mee estimated there might be around 32 such villages, though he could only confirm 24. Later research in the early 2000s used parish records, church registers, local newspapers, and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission data to refine that count. Today, the most widely accepted number is 53 villages and parishes in England and Wales. And when you map them, there is no clear geographic pattern. No shared terrain, economy, or religious makeup explains why one village was spared while another just miles away was not. And this randomness matters. These villages weren't safer. They didn't avoid sending men to war, nor were they uniquely cautious in enlistment. Many sent large portions of their population to the front. The difference, if it can even be called that, came down to chance. Because in the trenches, the mud, the gas, and the countless ways men lived or died during World War I, survival was often a matter of luck. The losses touched everyone and changed society forever. For some, the Thankful Villages felt like places that had somehow escaped that transformation. The scale of death in the First World War didn't just leave grief in its wake, it left silence where an entire family line once had been. With so many young men gone, countless homes were left without sons, without brothers, without anyone to inherit what generations before them had built. Estates that had passed from father to son for centuries suddenly had no clear heir. Titles vanished or passed to distant relatives who had never expected to bear them. Farms were sold and family businesses disappeared. In villages and great houses alike, the loss of these men didn't just break hearts. It unraveled the very structure of inheritance, quietly reshaping who held land, wealth, and power across England. And while the Thankful Villages saw all of their men return, they were far from unchanged by the war. These were not the same places the young men and women had left behind. One of the most well-known Thankful Villages is Upper Slaughter in the Cotswolds. It's a place that now feels almost impossibly picturesque. Stone cottages, rolling countryside. It almost looks carefully composed, and this quiet gentleness is what draws visitors from around the world. During the First World War, 24 men and 1 woman left Upper Slaughter to serve, and every one of them came back. And that record actually held through the Second World War as well. 36 villagers served and 36 returned. So Upper Slaughter became known as a doubly thankful village. There is no traditional war memorial standing at its center. Instead, the local church took two simple wood plaques to offer thanks for the safe return of those who left. But again, survival didn't mean these men returned untouched. They returned with injuries, both psychological and physical, and many documented that they had completely changed personalities. When the 24 villagers of Upper Slaughter came home, many carried what we would now recognize as PTSD, then called shell shock. At the time, there was a deep stigma surrounding both physical and psychological wounds, and in the push to rebuild and move forward, many of these struggles were ignored or quietly pushed aside. And there was something else too: survivor's guilt. These men had lived, but they had seen others die. They had watched friends and men from neighboring villages fall in battle. They had endured the horrors of trench warfare, and many had taken part in violence themselves. And they carried that weight home with them. But in villages filled with relief and gratitude, there was often little space to express that kind of grief. They returned not only as survivors, but as witnesses, holding experiences they could not easily share, even with the people who loved them and were celebrating their return. Now, if we look at another village in the north, through the Midlands, past the industrial cities of Lancaster, there is a quieter stretch of countryside, and there's a small parish called Arkholm. In 1914, its population was around 320 people. And yet, in one of the most staggering statistics attached to any thankful village, Arkholm sent 59 men. 59 men from 320 people is just under 20% of the population, and every single one of them returned. Think about what that means in proportion. Nearly 1 in 5 of the total population, men, women, and children, put on a uniform and went to war. And every one of them came home. Arkholm is also doubly thankful. Decades later, the vicar at the local Baptist parish put it like this: they were surrounded by villages where people were not returning. The community knew exactly what it had been spared, not through any special virtue or caution, but simply and terribly through luck. This village has no war memorial in the traditional sense. What it has is its records, the lists of men who served, and the knowledge of what they came back to. A few hours south and east on the flat plains of Yorkshire sits Catwick. It's a farming village, small, unpretentious, not particularly famous for anything except, as of 1918, the fact that all 30 of the men who left came home. The village blacksmith marked the occasion in the most literal way possible. During the war, he nailed a horseshoe to the doorpost of his forge, and around it, he placed 30 coins, pennies and halfpennies, and even a German and Swiss coin, one for each man who had gone away. As the war dragged on, the coins remained. His intention had been to remove them as they lost members of their community. And when one by one the men came home, the coins stayed where they were. They were a record, a prayer, a tally, but all 30 came back, and the horseshoes and the coins stayed on the doorpost. And then in 1939, when war began again, Catwick sent another 30 men. Again, everyone returned, and Catwick is also doubly thankful. Stories like the blacksmith horseshoe became village legends, and they don't appear in regimental records or national archives, so they're often missed in more academic evaluations of post-war England. But they're still an important part of history. They're deeply local and deeply human, and they're exactly the kind of stories that Arthur Mee was trying to preserve when he first started counting thankful villages. Now, the 3 villages I just spoke of are all doubly thankful, and there was only 14 of these doubly thankful villages. Wales has 3 thankful villages, and 2 of them are doubly thankful. Welsh thankful villages carry their own cultural weight. Wales suffered disproportionate losses in the First World War. The Welsh division was devastated at Mametz Woods in 1916. It was a brutal 5-day battle during the Somme. The 38th Welsh Division suffered 4,000 casualties, around a fifth of its strength. And the losses were so severe that the division was kept from the front line for nearly a year afterward. That battle and loss still deeply resonates with Welsh national memory, So the existence of these three thankful villages in that context is extraordinary, and they hold additional special significance. So why are we still talking about thankful villages? Why did Arthur Mee feel compelled to find them, document them, name them nearly 2 decades after the war ended? Part of the answer is grief. Britain in the 1930s was still a nation working through extraordinary loss. 1 million dead across the empire, entire cohorts of young men gone, and the social rupture of the wars caused the collapse of old hierarchies and the beginnings of the welfare state, as well as many political upheavals. All of these results were the shadow of the same catastrophe, and in that context, the Thankful Villages offered something rare, a story where it went right, where the worst didn't happen, even if the reality of that was not as picturesque as it sounded. Thankful Villages also offer something subtler. The Thankful Villages are a mirror. They show us, by contrast, exactly how catastrophic and widespread the losses everywhere were. You can quote statistics: 700,000 British dead, tens of millions worldwide, and they are staggering. But walk through the streets of Arkholm or Upper Slaughter, knowing that these 53 places were the exemption among 16,000, and the weight of the war becomes something tangible in a different way. Particularly after the Second World War, where the loss was even more staggering, these villages represented a backward glance that didn't focus on death alone. Now, for our US listeners, it's important to note that the collective memory of the First World War in Europe is different from that in the United States. Britain's losses, as devastating as they were not the highest among the Allied powers. The United States, which entered the war in 1917, lost just over 100,000 service members. A huge number, but far smaller in proportion to its population and the length of its involvement. France, by contrast, bore a heavier burden, losing around 1.3 million people as the war was fought largely on its own soil. And Germany lost roughly 2 million men. A quick note, since we're talking about grief, but in Germany, we don't hear about these things because Germany and grief took on yet another dimension. Defeat, revolution, and economic crisis complicated mourning. There was no shared narrative of victory to frame the sacrifice in. Families still lost sons and brothers and fathers, but there was less a sense that those deaths held anything except collapse and humiliation. In different ways, each nation was left to reckon not only with how many they had lost, but how and whether they were allowed to remember them. There is also this question of what we remember and why. The dominant memorial culture of the First World War, the war memorials on village greens and in high streets, is the culture of the dead. But the Thankful Villages remind us that commemoration can take another form, not naming the loss, but naming that which returned, naming that which sustained, and giving thanks for it. And that tradition is still alive. Researchers continue to investigate whether more Thankful Villages exist, looking into gaps in local records, church ledgers that were never digitized, and family memories passed down. Memorial days in each country commemorate and take a moment to pause and reflect on these massive world-changing events. And the Thankful Villages occupy a strange and moving position in that remembrance. World War I changed everything, from the social structures of the United Kingdom to the way that we remember the war dead. But in 53 villages, where everyone came home, we'd like to think that things didn't change all that much. This has been Footnoting History. If you like the podcast, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Thank you for listening, and remember, the best stories are found in the footnotes.